Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new here, my name is Kailin and I post new videos every single week, and I post videos mainly about eating disorder recovery and intuitive eating. So if that's something that you're interested in, I would love for you to click onto that subscribe button down below and become part of our little family. But for today's video, I'm actually starting a new series on my channel, which is going to be called Listen to This. And in this series, I'm basically going to take certain scenarios and sort of have a little bit of a pep talk with you if this is something that you experience with. So I don't know if that's clear, but essentially from the title of this video, you can see that you can listen to this video after a binge, and I'm here to sort of help with emotional regulation, to give you some tips of what to do and what not to do, and to really just be that support when maybe you don't have a lot of supportive people in your life or people who understand what you're going through. Binge eating disorder is something that I struggled with in the past, and it can be extremely isolating, and I feel like there's nothing more lonely than the feeling that comes after a binge. We have a lot of guilt, we have a lot of fear, and oftentimes our eating disorder can push us to make decisions that actually continue the binge cycle instead of actually stopping the cycle in its tracks. So if you've clicked on this video, I'm going to assume that you struggle with binge eating, whether that is selective binge eating or whatever it might be. But I do want to say that there is a huge difference between binge eating and eating more than you're used to. For example, eating a lot of ice cream in one night is not exactly categorized as a binge. It's very human of us to eat past the point of comfort, and that is okay, and it's a human experience. However, binge eating is usually characterized as like an out-of-body experience where we tend to eat a large amount of food in a very short period of time, usually within 2 hours or so. And throughout this episode, we feel very out of control, and like I mentioned, it's kind of like an out-of-body experience where you're looking down on yourself, but you can't stop a binge once it's beginning. It's very, very hard. And so once the binge finishes, usually we are left with a lot of different thoughts, a lot of different emotions that I hope to help you navigate in this video. So if you're watching this because you did just binge, the first thing that I want you to do is like take a really big deep breath in, okay? Just chances are you're holding a lot of tension inside that beautiful body of yours, and we're stressed, and our body holds on to that stress, and it can create a lot of discomfort in our body, which can exacerbate the discomfort that is already there from our binge. For anybody who has ever binged themselves, they know that this is a very uncomfortable feeling and that it doesn't feel good. But you know what else doesn't make the situation better? Is making yourself feel shitty because you binged. It doesn't help you, it doesn't help your loved ones, and it does not help break the cycle of binging. In fact, when we reinforce shame after a binge, that could actually be worse for us in the future. And so I know it's very, 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 very difficult. I know that this goes without saying, but trying to be as gentle with yourself is one of the most important things that you can do. When we're thinking about the reasons why we binge, there are multiple reasons. There could be a trauma or emotional response, but 95% of the time when we're talking about binge eating, it's because of restriction. And there are 3 different types of restriction, and I always go over these different types of restriction with my clients. And the first type of restriction is just solely abstaining from food. So wanting something and not having it, right? Or replacing it with something else, or actually cutting out a complete category of food altogether. The second form of restriction, which I think is one of the most common, is conditional permission to eat. So for example, say you want cookies and you tell yourself, well, you can only have 2. Even though you're actually eating the cookies, it's still a form of restriction to put a certain cap or a certain amount on how many you're allowed to eat, which still puts your brain in a restrictive mindset, which is always going to be a beautiful recipe for binge eating. And the third form of restriction that I want us to talk about is actually eating the food in whatever quantity you do desire. However, the entire time you're telling yourself that you're doing something wrong, or that you're bad, or that you shouldn't be having these things. That is also a form of mental restriction. So it's not your fault that your body is desperate for food, and I just want to make that very clear, or desperate for comfort, or whatever it might be. But again, 95% of the cases that I see within my own work, within my research, has to do with a restrictive mindset. Online, there is a lot of unhelpful information when it comes to offsetting a binge. People will say drink a bunch of water, go on a walk, distract yourself, and these are not tools that actually address binge eating at all. In fact, it's usually just a delay and we end up having an even worse binge down the line, whether it be the next day or later that night. So the very first thing that I want you to do after a binge is put on something comfortable, put on something loose, because sometimes when we have our clothing directly on our body, it can make us pay attention more to our body, which can create body image distress. And so I want to make sure that you are wearing something comfortable, wearing loose pants or adjustable pants or something like that, or just like a big nightgown, whatever it might be. And I want you to get something that you can actually hold with your hands, whether that is a hot cup of tea or a glass of water, if you have a pet that you're able to hold, even if you have like an old stuffed animal that's from your childhood or that you still sleep with every night, whatever it might be, I want you to grab that thing that brings you comfort and hold on to it. And it's not like drinking that tea is going to just rid us of all of our emotions and things like that, but it can be very comforting just to actually physically ground ourselves with our hands. The coping skills that we're going to want to reach for are one of two. And the first category is distraction coping skills, and the next category are comfort coping skills. And these are going to look different for everybody. So I'm going to give myself as an example, but again, what comforts me or brings me safety or distraction is going to look very different from yours. So if I'm thinking of comfort, I'm thinking of, again, wearing something super, super comfy on my body. I'm thinking about not looking in the mirror or trying to check for any body changes. I'm thinking of my comfort TV show. I'm thinking of my pets. I can call a friend, which can be very comforting sometimes, even if we're not talking about the binge per se, and we're just in general talking. That is both a comfort and a distraction coping skill. Other distraction coping skills can be watching something on Netflix, which I find is very great, going on TikTok if your feed is quite safe, watching a show that you've already seen so that you're kind of able to predict where that show goes, reading a book, doing something with your hands, whatever it might be. These are all comfort as well as distraction coping skills. The biggest temptation that so many people have after a binge is to restrict the next day or to compensate somehow, whether that is with over-exercising or just exercising as a form of punishment, or whether that is trying to be good or get back on track the next day. I know that most people watching this video can probably relate to that thought and that sentiment. The most important thing that you can do to stop the restrict binge cycle is to stop the restriction after the binge. The next day, if you're thinking that you need a healthy breakfast, and I'm using that with very heavy quotations, then I would probably advise you to actually think about what you truly want. Even if you don't feel hungry the next morning and maybe you feel a little bit nauseous, because that can definitely happen, usually pushing when you eat or waiting long periods of time can actually make your nausea worse. And to that eating disorder brain of yours, it's basically going to reinforce that after we have a binge, we must restrict, which then again continues that cycle onwards, and your chances of binging again that week are incredibly high. I have a lot of clients who deal with binge eating disorder, and I've also seen a lot of them walk away more confident, happy, healthier than they've ever been because they've broken their cycle. Restriction and compensation is never, ever, ever going to bring you anything. It's not going to help you binge less. And I know that in the moment, it's going to feel like something that can bring relief, something that can, lessen our guilt. But at the same time, the reason that we feel guilty in the first place is because of this pattern of behavior. And so we're thinking short term instead of long term. And to reach long-term happiness, you might have to feel guilt in the moment. You might have to still eat even when you don't want to in order to break this pattern, instead of falling into the usual behaviors, which alleviates your guilt temporarily, but actually makes it a lot worse as you keep going. Another thing that I advise you heavily not to do, not to do ever, but especially after a binge, is to not look in the mirror, to not body check, to not do anything like that, because I promise you, with the amount of guilt and shame that you already feel, you're not gonna like what you see. And that has nothing to do with your body and everything to do with your mindset. When we diet or when we restrict ourselves or try to compensate by eating less, it encourages this feast, famine, mentality, which really messes with your brain. You cannot exercise or restrict your way out of a binge. That is impossible. I hope everybody watching this video does not have a scale in their home, or if they do, it's one that they don't really have access to. But another tip is definitely don't weigh yourself. What's the point? What's the point? That weight is not going to tell you anything. It's not going to alleviate your guilt. And say you see a lower number and that makes you feel happy, that's not a good thing. And say if we see a higher number and it makes us feel guilt, that's also not a good thing. So basically you're fucked either way, so we might as well not step on that scale at all. And if you do still have a scale, get rid of it. Get rid of it. Smash it to pieces, but wear goggles to be safe. Or just donate it or give it away or sell it if you want to make a couple of bucks or whatever it might be to put towards yourself. But weighing yourself does not make you happy long term, ever. And when we weigh ourselves, it's also a self-reinforcing behavior. The more you do it, the more you want to do it. And that number slowly starts to rule your life. And I've been there, I've done that, and I promise you that it's not worth it at all. When it comes to repairing your relationship with binge eating, we can't try to be perfect because perfect does not exist. Don't expect perfection from yourself because you're never ever going to be satisfied. Even though you want to stop binging, for example, it does not go away overnight. It takes time. And my love, you have time, so breathe easy, okay? You have to be honest about your restrictive behaviors. That is the first thing to be honest about, because if you're saying hand on your heart that you don't restrict at all, I think you have to take a way closer look at your life, at your food, at your guilt and shame, etc. Voltaire once said that perfect is the enemy of good, and I think that that's very true. Things in life are not black and white. And when we suffer from disordered eating, we often have a tendency to have black or white thinking, to either think that we are good or that we are bad, to either think that we are healthy or that we are unhealthy, to either think that we are pretty or that we are hideous. And there tends to not be this middle ground, which is life in general. It takes place in this middle ground. And binging less frequently is to be just as celebrated as not binging at all, for example. So say you go a while without binging and then you binge, that is progress. Don't beat yourself up for the binge, but actually look and be curious as to why it may have happened. Look at your progress and congratulate yourself for that. Don't look at these moments in isolation, but look at the progress that you're making overall. I know that this is really hard for many people, but you cannot keep your pain inside. Talk to somebody. I have a private and free Facebook group that is always linked in the descriptions of my video. So if you just want to go somewhere and hope that you'll find like-minded people who will understand, I hope that that's always a safe place for everybody. You can also leave your experience in the comments and talk to one another. We are all here to support each other. And I hope that those are options for people who don't have safe individuals in their life or people that they feel comfortable talking to. If you can't talk to a friend, if you can't talk to a family member, then talk to some of us in this community that we've created, because I know that there are so many people who are so incredibly supportive and who want to help other people in this community see the progress and change that they've made themselves. And sometimes talking about it can even be talking about it with yourself. That it could be journaling, talking out loud. Like I'm talking out loud to myself right now. And I talk to myself a lot, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. Be your own best friend if you can. One thing I also want to say is that binge eating disorder is a mental illness. That is what it is. And you cannot, again, exercise, compensate your way out of a mental illness, because that's not how any mental illnesses work. For example, for depression, I can't just pretend to be happy in order to have my depression go away. That's not how it works. Another note that I quickly want to add here is that you cannot eat intuitively if you suffer with a poor relationship from food. So for example, the next day and you tell yourself that you're not hungry and that we shouldn't eat when we're not hungry, your hunger cues are not fully present, and you cannot possibly be an intuitive eater when you are still binging or restricting or falling into disordered eating patterns. Again, not eating can make bloating, nausea, pain even worse the next day. Try to do something kind just for yourself, and to do something out of love. After a binge, we usually have a lot of self-hatred towards ourselves and a lot of shame, and we want to counteract those emotions with an act of love, and that is going to look different for every single person. For me, I really like putting hair oil in my hair, doing my skincare routine, doing something that is only for me, that I do out of self-love, and that can definitely help change our mindset in the moment too. Something that I hear a lot about when it comes to binge eating is to try to fight the urge to binge, and I promise you that you can't. You cannot just have the urge to binge and offset it, because the urge to binge is a physical response from your body that it is starving, that it is hungry, that it's underfed, that you're not giving it the food that it was actually craving that day, whatever it might be. So we don't really want to focus on offsetting a binge when we already are there and everything is right in front of us. Taking a walk, drinking a warm cup of tea, that's bullshit, and it's not going to help from somebody who used to try those things herself. What we have to focus on is kind of being curious about how we got to this place. Did you eat all of your meals? Were you satisfied with all of them? Did you have everything that you wanted? If you deny yourself of food in this moment and try to replace it with, again, more restriction, you're gonna keep the cycle going and going and going. Keep the foods that you struggle with at home. And something that I really encourage people doing is, for example, say we binge on cookies. Try to have a cookie with every single meal, every single snack in the quantity that you want throughout the day, and continue that for a week or two or whatever it might be. And that way you're actually going to normalize cookies being like an everyday occurrence, or having them whenever you want them, which is probably going to give the eating disorder less power over cookies in the first place, because you're actually having them instead of eating them in a restricted way, or potentially not eating them at all except during a binge. We are not addicted to certain foods that make us binge. Our attitude, our mindset, and how we think about these foods is the most important thing. See if you're labeling food throughout the day as good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. This is a perfect example of how we can be curious about how we approach food. But again, be gentle with yourself. If you're here right now and you just had a binge, breathe. Breathe, breathe, breathe. Tell yourself that it's not your fault. Remind yourself of why this happens. It's not because of you. It's because of restriction. It's because of diet culture. It's because of the world that we've been brought up in. And it's not your fault, but maybe we have the responsibility to make our life one that we actually want to live. Celebrate every single victory. So if you had a binge and you eat the next day, be proud of yourself, even if you don't feel it. Celebrate it all. Use that voice of compassion even when it feels like something that we can't even access in the moment. Just tell yourself, I'm proud of you, I'm proud of you, I'm proud of you, even if you don't believe it. Remind yourself that help is available, whether you are reaching out to a coach, whether or not you are going to therapy. Talk to somebody who is educated in eating disorders. A coach should never make you feel shame, and neither should a therapist or doctor in any way. And if they do, that's a huge sign that they are not the right person for you. There's no track that you need to get back onto. The only thing that you have to do is eat properly and nourish your body the next day, eating the foods that you crave, or even forcing yourself to eat if you're not feeling hungry. I know it's difficult to put yourself in the shoes of other people, but sometimes just flipping the script and asking yourself what you would say to a friend can actually increase your self-compassion, because you're removing yourself from the equation. And it can even just help you make sense of the situation even more. Be as nice to yourself as possible. You deserve a life with food freedom. You deserve a life without shame, without guilt, without rules. You deserve that. And you have to remind yourself of that too. You're strong and you will overcome this. I promise you that much. But I hope that this video gave you a little bit of peace, a little bit of guidance, a little bit of support throughout this process. And if there are other videos that you would like me to make for my Listen to This series, then please, you can just leave some recommendations down below. But just know that myself, as well as the rest of the HWK community, are here for you, for whatever you may need. I love you, and I always want what's best for you. So I'm sending you a nice, big, warm virtual hug. I wish I could be there to hug you in person. Just know that you're not a failure or anything like that. And try your best, your very, very best, to use that compassionate voice of yours. And if you can't, I hope that you just come back to this video and listen to some of the things that I had to say. This is a reminder to do something kind for yourself, and I really hope to see you in my next video. Bye, friends.